This is the historic Mabee farmhouse, one of the oldest and most historically significant structures in New York State. It's named after the Mabee family, who lived here for nearly 200 years. And while there's so much history to explore at this site, over the next couple of days we'll be posting a series of videos that focus specifically on life at the farm during the colonial period. This video will just be an introduction to the Mabees and the colonial time period that they lived in. Who were these people, and what brought them to this little plot of land so many centuries ago to start a farm? Well, if we want to answer those questions, we have to do a little bit of background research. And I think we'll start with this map of New York State, because when you're doing any kind of social studies or studying any kind of history, one of the most important themes to look at is geography, which is to say, how does the landscape affect people? How can people make a living with the natural resources they have around them? And how can they travel with the physical features they encounter? Well, I've chosen this map because it shows you all of the major bodies of water in New York State. You see, if we're going back to the colonial period, before planes or trains or cars or any modern form of transportation, really your best ways of getting around were by using navigable bodies of water. That is to say, a large stream or a lake or an ocean, something you could take a boat across. In the colonial period, boats were the fastest way to travel and the easiest way to carry large amounts of goods. So to understand the story of the Mabees, I first have to introduce you to two major rivers, the two largest rivers in New York State. Now I want you to pause the video and locate the Hudson River on the map, because this is probably the most important river for a study of colonial New York. Now, the Hudson River is unique because it's a very large, very deep river. It's the kind of thing you could take a large sailing ship down, like the very same sailing ships the Europeans would cross the Atlantic Ocean in. This is a picture of the Half Moon, which was a Dutch sailing ship captained by an Englishman named Henry Hudson. In 1609, Hudson took this ship up the river, becoming one of the first Europeans to explore it. And it's for that reason that we actually called the Hudson River by his name. The other major river I want you to find is the Mohawk, and you can take the time now to pause and locate it. The Mohawk River is the second largest river in New York State, but it's not quite as large or quite as deep as the Hudson is. And in some cases, the Mohawk River features these crazy waterfalls, which make it pretty difficult to navigate. Like, look at this one. This is Cohoes Falls. Would you want to take your boat over this? Yeah, I don't think so. So while a large sailing ship like the Half Moon probably couldn't make it up the Mohawk River, a smaller rowboat like these bateaux here could. And even though these bateaux don't go terribly fast by our modern standards, I can guarantee you it's a lot faster than trying to walk. So think of these two rivers, the Hudson and Mohawk, as your colonial highways, the Hudson going north and south, and the Mohawk going east and west. These two rivers would allow travel and trade to happen, and would connect all the different groups of people who made their lives in colonial New York. So who were all these different people? Well, let's take a look. First of all, before the colonial period, before any Europeans ever stepped foot on the shores of what would later become New York State, we of course have Native American groups who made their lives here first. The two major groups would be the Algonquin, which you can see here in the magenta, and the Iroquois, whose homelands are here in the green. Both of these major Native American groups were farmers, hunters, and fishers. After many, many generations of living here, both the Iroquois and the Algonquin had become experts of using the natural resources around them to make a comfortable life for themselves. It's important to keep in mind that both of these groups had completely different cultures, different languages, different histories, and even different types of governments. We're going to focus today on the Iroquois because they're more directly related to the story of the Mabees. You see, the Iroquois were not just one single group, but were actually several different nations or tribes which had come together to form a confederacy. From east to west, these tribes were the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And while we might know them as the Iroquois today, that's actually not their real name. The Iroquois referred to themselves as the Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse. And that's actually central to their cultural identity, one of the easiest ways to differentiate the Haudenosaunee from their neighbors, the Algonquins. Later, a sixth nation, the Tuscarora, would join the Confederacy as well. Most of the time, the different nations governed themselves. But when an issue arose that affected all the different nations, they would send delegates or representatives to a central council fire in the lands of the Onondaga. There they would decide what course of action to take. One such major issue was the arrival of a new group of people, the Dutch, who had come across the Atlantic Ocean from their home country, the Netherlands, and started to explore and settle in the Hudson River Valley. The Dutch came not to fight, but to trade, and the Iroquois decided it would be in their best interest to trade with the Dutch as well. The Dutch set up 3 major trade posts, including New Amsterdam, Beverwyck, and Schenectady. But the Dutch weren't the only Europeans to come to New York in the colonial period. To the north, the French set up a colony in Canada, and to the east, the English had set up colonies in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. As you can see, colonial New York was a pretty diverse place, with many different peoples, languages, and customs all mixing together. Sometimes these groups would cooperate or form alliances with each other. At other times, these different groups would come into conflict with each other. And believe it or not, all these different groups were vying for control of one resource in particular. And that is beavers. Yes, the humble beaver. With its thick, soft fur, beaver pelts were highly prized in Europe and could be sold for a lot of money. When the Native Americans realized this, they began to hunt beavers and trade them with the Europeans. Almost all of the economic activity in colonial New York revolved around this one trade. So now that we have a little bit of background information, we can get back to the story of the Mabees. And we'll start in the little town of New Amsterdam, where Jan Mabee was born in 1656. This is what New Amsterdam would have looked like at the time. You can see it's a pretty bustling place. This is where all the large ocean-going sailing ships would come and dock and either bring supplies to the Dutch colony or take raw materials out of the Dutch colony and back to Europe. It must have been a pretty exciting place to grow up, especially in 1664, when a fleet of armed English ships sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam and took over the Dutch colony. When the English took over, they renamed New Amsterdam New York, which is the name the city has today. The Dutch town of Beverwyck was also renamed Albany, and I'm sure you guys have been to Albany before. But even though the English renamed a few towns here and there, they didn't do much to change everyday life for the people of colonial New York. Even as some English immigrants arrived to the newly captured colony, most people stuck to their Dutch roots and culture. We often refer to the culture of New York at this time as Anglo-Dutch, which means that it's a mixture of both English and Dutch. So as a young man in the 1680s, Jan Mabee moves north to the town formerly known as Beverwyck, now known as Albany. And it's hard to say for certain what he was trying to do there. My personal suspicion is that he was trying to get rich from the fur trade. But from the documentary evidence we have available, it doesn't look like things were working out too well for Jan in the 1680s. He doesn't have a house that we know of, or very little personal property that we can prove. I think times were pretty tough for Jan, until he met somebody. Annette Boersboom had grown up in the Dutch town of Schenectady. Her father was a Dutchman and a brickmaker by trade, but her mother, interestingly enough, was a Mohawk woman and a fur trader. Her name was Gretje, and she came to Schenectady originally to trade. But she chose to settle down with a Dutch man and start a family together. Their children were half Mohawk and half Dutch. They were one of the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, and because they were the easternmost nation, they were the ones in most frequent contact with Europeans. It would be very common to see Mohawk men and women either living at Schenectady or passing through on their way to Albany. Now, we're not really sure when, but at some point, Annette meets Jan, and they decide to get married and start a family. They move into Annette's house in Schenectady, where they have 10 children together. Yes, that's right, 10 children. This is a map of Schenectady at the time, and you can see Jan and Annette lived in this house right here. But what else can you see on this map? As a historian, there's a lot of information we can get from a document like this. Well, to the left of the map you can see the Mohawk River, which again was how people were traveling and trading back in those days. In the middle, you can see all the homes and houses, the little buildings that the Dutch had built there. At the top of the map, you can see the one road that would lead through the pine bush to Albany and connect the two towns together. And off to the right, you can also see a lot of farmland. You see, furs were how people made money in the colonial period, but farming was how they fed themselves. Unless you own a lot of land, it's hard to get rich from farming, but it's a stable source of food, and that's probably the most important thing. A farm can also be passed down from generation to generation, and will only get more productive as more work is done on it. You can think of a farm as a secure, long-term investment in the future. And so, in 1705, Jan and Annette purchased some land far out of town on which they decided to start a farm. They would have to travel more than 8 miles up the Mohawk River into what the Dutch referred to as the Woestijne, or the wilderness in English. Here the forests grew dark and dense, and all sorts of wild predators roamed about, including bears, wolves, and bobcats. And even though it's only 8 miles, which is a short journey by our modern standards, this was an all-days journey in the colonial period. So the Mabees would be really isolated from their friends in Schenectady. They would have to learn to be self-sufficient and get all the things they needed to survive from their own land. So it must have been a little bit scary, but nevertheless, Jan and Annette decide to make this journey and start their life anew in the Woestijne. And of course, they brought their kids with them. Now, of the 10 kids that they had, only 8 were still living with mom and dad at this time. But all of these kids had vital roles to play on the farm. By the way, that's why colonial families were usually so big, because back then, kids were great sources of labor. I always try to put myself in the shoes of Abraham Mabee right here, who was only about 10 years old when his parents came up to him and said, "Abraham, we are leaving the safety of Schenectady. We are moving out deep into the Woestijne, deep into the wilderness. We're going to have to build a new home for ourselves, grow our own food, and make our own clothes. And you have to help." Imagine being in Abraham's shoes. Do you think you'd be excited to make this trip? Or would you rather not? Well, to find out what Abraham's life was really like, you can watch the next videos in this series, this virtual tour of the Mabee farm. We'll do our best to show you the sights, the sounds, and, well, maybe even the smells of the colonial period. And if you ever want to learn more, the best thing to do is to come to the Mabee farm. Unfortunately, we're currently closed because of the corona pandemic. But before you know it, we'll be open again and doing tours every day, Tuesday through Saturday. So as much as I hope you enjoy these videos, what I really hope is that we get to see you someday soon right here at the Mabee Farm Historic Site.